Hello, welcome to Chapter 10 on Artificial Neural Networks. I'm again recording this at home because of the pandemic. I again have a cat on my lap, so if you hear some meowing or other noise, that's probably why, so I apologize for that. But that's what we do today. Just a quick note that this starts chapter or part 2 of the book on neural networks and deep learning, and to me this is really the heart of this course on neural networks and deep learning. Much of the research today on machine learning focuses on deep learning and neural networks. Deep learning is just a way of training large neural networks and allows us to have very large neural networks, so the two are very closely related. And that's why we've gone over the beginning material quite quickly so that we can get here. Now we'll slow down. And so in this unit, we'll only actually cover half of Chapter 10. And so we'll go over the first half of Chapter 10 here today. This lays out the basic idea of our neural network and how it's set up. Talks about the biology of neural networks, and there's a long history of artificial neural networks starting in 1940s, and it's the popularity and interest in them has gone up and down over time, and we've had different successes. So you can read a little bit of this information here. I in fact did my PhD research in artificial neural networks back in the early 90s, and they were getting again popular there, but then we ran into some issues in the 90s here because we couldn't get beyond a 3-layer network. Our training just and the methods we were using just did not work beyond that, and the techniques of deep learning just hadn't been discovered, and so they actually went out of favor in the late 90s and the 2000s until some more advancements came around that allow us to do what we do today. So, again, a lot of this is the idea is we're kind of basing this on biological neurons. If you remember, you were back to your biology class where we have a neuron and we have lots of inputs coming into this. We have these what are called dendrites, these long connections feeding into the neuron, and the neuron has one output called an axon, which goes often a long way to another part or area of the brain, and then it has tendrils there that connect up to other cells there. So again, we're trying to make a abstraction of this, and there's a lot of discussion and research today on how to abstract this and what's the important parts of a neuron that need to be abstracted. We're going to abstract it at a relatively high level, just having connections going in, this summing, and then sending out an output to other neurons. But there are people who are worried about time sequences where the output here is actually a sequence of signals. It's high level voltage, low, high, low, and then the frequency of that changes over time. And if you get a lot, beep, 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 a lot of high voltage signals over here, that's a lot of signal, and that's important. Just the sequence of that, or at least the fact that you're getting sequential outputs out of that. We're going to actually approximate that with just a single value, a number between 0 and 1 for how much output we're sending out of this, rather than each signal. But there is a fair amount of research and networks now that are actually modeling each spike of this and talking about spiking neurons. And modeling those. There are other people there are actually different types of neurons and lots of different channels of how the information feeds in. So all these dendrites there are different types of dendrites and different chemical trails through this. There are, I think, 12 different chemical trails of how electricity is conducted through different neurons and down this. And so there are actually people and models of this that are very specific in modeling each of the different chemical channels and monitoring voltages and doing that. And so there are very detailed models of each neuron, and some researchers are also doing that. So one of the open research questions out there is just what level of detail do we model a neuron? And so again, we're going to stick to a relatively high and common model of a neuron, of a biological neuron. But again, that's certainly an open question at this point. And again, we're often going to look at layers of this. A lot of times the human body has its neurons grouped into layers. A common area of this is the vision system, where you'll have all the neurons all the sensors in the eye, the rods and cones, feeding into the first section of the vision system, and then that section, neurons there feeding into a different section of the vision system, and then there are different layers of this vision systems that build more complex abstractions of what you see. But again, we're going to be looking at layers, and there's research being done on other ways where rather than having each layer connected, you'll have a group of neurons all connected together, and different associative memory structures and that sort of stuff. So there's actually lots of work on different structures for neural networks out there, but we'll stick with the relatively simple layered network. So I'm going to skip over this a little bit. That there was a lot of dispute early on in neural networks on what they could compute and not, and a lot of that has been figured out. So I'm just going to kind of skip over this section with that, and let's talk about the Perceptron. This is one of the simplest neural network architectures. It comes back from the 1950s, and this is what we'll be looking at, a modified version of this. And so what we have, if you remember our version of a neuron here, we have all these connections feeding into the neuron. We have some summative value of those connections here, and then some output going to other neurons here, and that's what we're looking at here. We assume we have some inputs, probably from other neurons in another layer connected here. So each of these is a value between 0 and 1, and how active these cells, these units are. And these feed into this neuron. This is our current unit that we're going to do. And each of these connections has a weight. So the idea is that the connection, the synaptic connection here between our neuron and other network neurons, it has different efficiencies, and as this is used over time, it's strengthened and become stronger, and so that's the weight here. So every connection has a weight. From every neuron to this neuron has a weight, and often it's valued between 0 and 1, although nowadays it can get higher. This neuron actually just does a sum, a weighted sum. So it takes each input, like x1 times the weight from that connection, and adds that to its sum, and then takes the input from the second neuron input, multiplies it by the second weight, and adds that to the sum, and takes the third input times the third weight and adds it up. And so again, we might have hundreds of these inputs feeding into this, and hundreds of different weights. And so this neuron creates what is called a weighted sum of values. One possible function in the early function was that the idea was neurons were either on or off, and so if this sum reached some threshold, it would output a 1, otherwise it output a 0 here. So it output either 0 or 1 depending on if this sum reached some threshold for this, and this was called a step function. Nowadays we're going to use different versions of this function, not necessarily the step function. We'll talk about that in a sec. So again, this talks about this steps, functions, and again, different versions of this. We're going to skip over kind of this a little bit. You can read through this if you want. We're going to get into having multiple layers and then outputs of this. Again, a lot of this is written in vector math or linear algebra math, and so these equations are often hard for people to understand if you haven't had linear algebra. So don't worry about some of this math if you haven't had calculus and linear algebra at this point. Now, one of the important ideas here is a learning rule called Hebbs Rule. Again, this comes back from the 1940s. And the idea is that the connection between two neurons will go stronger if that connection is used more often. So if one neuron triggers another neuron at the same time, that connection strengthens. And again, cells that fire together are wired together. And so sometimes we'll try to use this rule or a modified version of this rule for this. And again, this is a perceptron learning rule, and we're not going to go over this too much because we're actually going to look at a different learning rule that's used a lot in here. So like I mentioned, interest in neural networks has gone up and down, and there's have been supporters and positions against it. The first time was, and one of the reasons why we didn't see a growth of the neural networks was this. In the 50s and 60s, were in 1969, two well-known researchers here, Minsky and Papert, talked about a weakness with the perceptron in that it couldn't even solve a simple XOR function, and which all of our other systems could do. And this talks a little bit about that. And one of the reasons is just the way this function was set up and things, and it's funny that this really destroyed, or really curtailed research for this for about 10 years after this, even 20 years after this. But again, a simple adjustment to this actually allows this network to solve this, and people later figured that out. Okay, so let's look at a multi-layered perception and this training method called backpropagation, which we're going to be looking at now. And so what we're going to have is we're going to set up our units in a set of layers here. So we might have some inputs, maybe from sensors like our rods and cones in our eye, or touch sensors or something like that are feeding into our network. So these are simulating that. And then we have, we'll group a whole set of neurons or these units in a layer, and then we'll have another layer. This is a simple 3-layer network. We have the input layer and the output layer. This is what we kind of look as the output. And then this is what's called the hidden layer, because it's not either the input or the output. Sometimes we have bias functions here that are just always on, that helps with some of the math here. These are just, again, what are called threshold logic units, where this is either on or off. And again, we'll be getting rid of that, but this is what that LU stand for here. But again, this is the common layer structure of a neural network with layers, and we'll often add more hidden layers. We'll have an input layer, output layer, and maybe multiple hidden layers in here. So this is mainly the idea of this artificial neural network. And when we get into deep neural networks, we'll just have more and more layers here between the input and the output layers. So, and again, back when I was in grad school, we're getting this age in the late 80s, early 90s. We had some great work done on these multi-layered perceptions, and again, we thought this was going to really be the thing. And again, this was a really big area of research for a while, but then again, we couldn't get beyond this 3-layer model until later on some people discovered some really cool fixes for this. It's interesting, some of the greatest advancements in neural networks, like in a lot of sciences, come while these things are kind of out of favor. People working in the background thinking this is still a good idea, and even though it's hard to get funding and not other people are doing it, they're still looking at this, and they find the ways to fix these issues before and allow for great advancements later on. So people like Hinton, Rummelhart, did some amazing work on their kind of out of the spotlight initially. So let's talk about backpropagation, which is this training method which is used to train networks, and modified versions of this are used still today. So let's talk about how we run through this network. We train our network in what are called batches or mini batches. So we might send 32 samples through our neural network each time. So each of these passes is called an epoch. So during each mini batch, we send inputs to the input layer. And so the idea is that, let's go up here. Let's say we have a bunch of images we're going to train on these this neural network, or let's do the iris data. A lot of we feed in one set of iris measurements to this neural network. We set the inputs to that. We then calculate the hidden layer, calculate the outputs, and the outputs should say that this is this iris, and so there'll be 3 outputs, one for each type of iris, and we'll expect this one to be on. And if this one isn't on, we will then adjust the weights, and so we'll look and see if we want this one should be on and this one is already on. We'll strengthen this weight so that this one would be on since this one is on already. If this one's off, should be off, but it's on, and there's a connection here, we'll decrease this weight here. And there's a really cool mathematical formula for doing this that involves differentiation and taking the differential of the activation function here. And again, we're not going to go into that calculus, but if you like it, it's really cool to learn, and that's why a lot of these activation functions are now differentiable training functions that we'll use at times, although we have now actually gone beyond that. But so we put in one input, we update the hidden layer, we figure out the outputs, and we figure out what all the weight changes would be. We feed another input, calculate what the response is in, and figure out what new changes. We don't necessarily make all those changes, we just keep adding up all the changes to all these layers for this batch. So we'll do a whole batch in here and keep adding up, because we might put in one input that would suggest to increase this weight and another input which would say to decrease this weight. And so rather than increasing or decreasing, we'll feed this mini batch in here and just keep a running total of all the changes to the weights. And after that batch is done, then we'll actually make all those changes to these weights for this. So this is what they're kind of trying to go through here. We run these epochs or mini batches. We run a mini batch, we put it in the input, we calculate what the hidden layer is and the output. This is called the forward pass in here. And then once we know that, we figure out what the output was and what it should be, and we calculate the error in the output. So maybe we thought it should have been this flower when it predicted some other flower, and there's an error here in the outputs, and then we will propagate that rule back, the changes in the networks, using what is called the chain rule from calculus, and we'll propagate changes back to the weights of the network, so that next time it will be closer to the correct output. And for this. So, and again, this talks about how we propagate these errors backwards, and this is why it's called back propagation, with this gradient error descent. So we can calculate the errors not only in these connections, but also these connections. And again, when we have multiple layers, we can propagate these errors back through the connections. So. So again, what we've done is we've changed our activation function to something that is differentiable, and we'll actually look at a couple different activation functions here. So one is commonly used, is called the sigmoid function. It goes from 0 to 1 here. Another one is tangent h, the hyperbolic tangent, which actually goes from -1 to +1. Now, these are actually related. You can actually change the parameters in the sigmoid function or tang h to make them fit each other, and they're very similar functions if you make some adjustments to them. But again, notice that the step function was -1, -1, and then it hits some threshold off, and at 0 it jumps up and it's +1, and that's not differentiable from a calculus point of view and has some issues. So we've tried to switch to these smoother functions, but we've actually found that the function we like the most is this rectified linear unit function. RELU function, and again, what that does is it's 0 whenever the activation is negative, and then above that it just slowly increases in a linear fashion, but it doesn't top out at 1. It can keep going higher and higher. And again, one of the keys to deep learning has been to allow us to switch to this function, because it allows activations to go above 1, which allows some issues here. And again, this talks about derivatives. You don't need to know the derivatives so much, but again, that's just a calculus issue with how we do backpropagation with this area. So let's just jump to our network real quick. So again, we're going to look at our beginning section here, and then there'll be 4 other sections. The first section just looks at the biology, what we're talking about now, and the other 3 sections look at 3 different data sets and applying neural networks to this. So I always have to start with unit 0 and bring in our libraries. Now, one thing to note that we're bringing in the Keras libraries here. Keras is a high-level language or library for doing neural networks, particularly in deep learning issues. We're actually using the TensorFlow. So there's a generic version of this, and there's a TensorFlow version of this. So TensorFlow is a library that runs under Keras. Keras can run on a couple different is high level and can run on a couple different libraries, and so TensorFlow is an underlying library that Keras can run on. TensorFlow was created by Google and is well known and runs well with a lot of Google products. So we'll be using the TensorFlow version of Keras here when we import that. So again, we import all those libraries. And now let's just go over this. So again, this is just kind of a summary of this sort of stuff. And again, this is just the textbook does this graph of the different activation functions. So this is that same graph here showing these different functions for this. And we talk about, again, a multi-layer perceptron, where we'll have a set of input units. They'll feed to a set of hidden units, might feed to another set of hidden units. Here comes my cat. Just wait a sec. Okay, my cat wanted to say hello, hi, say hi to everyone. It's okay. Okay. Sorry about that. So we have these 2. We might have 1 or more hidden units here, and then we have a set of output units here. And we have connections. So like this hidden unit will receive connections from all the inputs here, and then it will then send its outputs to all the neurons or the units in the next layer for that generally. So and this is how we'll generally define these neural networks. We often set the number of inputs and the number of outputs here. This is what's called a sequential thing, because all of our layers will be connected together. Later on we'll get to non-sequential ones, because we may want to do some weird connections from this layer, jump up a couple layers to a different layer and stuff like that. But initially we'll just do sequential networks. These layers are called dense layers, because that means that every neuron is connected to every unit in the layer before. So we have a dense layer, and so this would say we have a dense layer with 8 neurons. So we just say add to our, so this is the name of our neural network. It's sequential. We say we're going to add a dense layer with 8 neural networks. Since this is the first layer, we also have to specify the input dimension, so we specify that, and we define the input size. Up here we could actually just put 4 in here. And here we'll add another layer called dense, another dense layer, and it'll have 6 units. That's this one. And then finally we'll add this layer, and again the output size is defined here as 3, because there'll be 3 outputs. Like maybe we're doing the iris data where we're just classifying 3 different iris stuff here. And again, we can specify the activation rule, and we'll use these rectified linear units a lot with our training here. So that's how, and this is Keras. This lets us set up these networks relatively simple. If we were doing this wasn't Keras, it would probably take us maybe 10 lines of TensorFlow code directly to do this, and it would be a little more complicated. So Keras just lets us do this a little easier. So. Okay, what I want you to do for this, there's a cool exercise at the end of chapter 10, exercise 1, and that uses the TensorFlow playground here. So the TensorFlow Playground is just a simple interactive version where you can set up networks here with neurons. You can have here we have one set of hidden layers and one set of output layers, and again the idea, and you can have different data sets, and the idea here is we have the orange and the blue dots, and we want a network to learn the difference between the orange and the blue, and we can start running the training algorithm. And relatively simple, after 100 epochs, it has learned a rule where the blue dots are, samples are, and where the orange dots are for this. And this kind of shows how this is set up and what the outputs are. It actually shows what kind of learning rules are learned by the hidden layers and what is fed in here to the network. So I want you to go through and try out this network and see how this works, and read through these, and some of these I want you to do write-up. So remember that we have our write-up 3, and there's 3 of these questions that I want you to do write-ups on. A lot of these you can just play with and see for this. So a couple things you can do here is you can change the activation function from tangent H to rectified learning units, and we can run this again and it will learn that. We're not going to worry too much about the learning rate next layer or regularization so much for this. You can also change the type of data that you're learning and look at some different types of data, and some of these are going to be very hard to learn. You can also add more or less hidden layers here, and you can add or subtract the number of neurons in each layer. So for some of these more complicated learning ones, particularly spiral ones, you're probably going to have to add more hidden layers and multiple and more neurons in those. Okay, so go through this simple exercise. Again, this is at the end of the chapter 10 exercises, but I've copied it here so you can see it. Okay, now we're going to look at applying this to some different neural network samples. Okay, so the book talks about classification and how this sets up, and implementing, again, it talks about implementing multilayered perception in Keras, the language here. It talks about Keras being this high-level language, and you can run it on different things. And again, we're going to actually be using this TensorFlow version of Keras, which is this kind of special version of Keras that runs just on TensorFlow for that. So when you see our inputs, they'll be that set up that way. But you can actually run Keras on different libraries underneath. We don't need to do any installing of TensorFlow and Keras. It's all built in for us already. So we're going to do this image classification. We're going to use the minst. Remember, minst is a bunch of digits, digitized digits, handwritten digits 1 to 10. We're actually going to switch that. They're switching to the fashion minst, which is a kind of similar set of data. But it shows pictures of different types of clothing, fashion items, and classifies them there rather than the digits 1 to 10. Some people find that the digits 1 to 10 are just not that interesting. So we're going to do that initially. So this is this section of code here. So again, we're going to import the data, and we actually have the class names. So we have things like coat or sneakers or shirt or sandal here. We're going to import our data and break our data. So this is the actually we're just printing it out. This is we have got 55,000 different images. Each of them are 28 by 28 pixels. That's in our training data. We've actually pulled out a separate validation set that we'll be using of 5,000 on our things, and then we're actually using a separate test set of 10,000. So we'll have both a training, a validation, and a test. So validation we'll be using during our method, and test will be kept entirely separate from this database. And this is, again, will be more common now to have this three-part stuff: training, validation, and test. So validation will be used during the training to see how we're doing and measure it. So we won't train on our validation data, but testing will be also separated entirely. So again, here's our different inputs. Here's our network setup. And so again, we're using the sequential model. We have our input that's 28 by 28, and since these are images, we have to flatten that out to one long input for us. So we set up that input layer. We then have our two hidden layers, and one has 300 and one has 100 units, and we're using these rectified linear units here. And then our output is 10 units because again we have 10 different classifications here of types of clothing, and we're using softmax. So softmax is a way of classifying this. The idea of softmax is to kind of convert some general numbers into probabilities. So if we had our output units, so here if we had our outputs, and let's say we just had 3 outputs, and they're just numbers, and this is, I'll just make integers. So let's say this one was 8, came out to 8, and this one was 1, and this was a 1 out, and the highest one should win. So the 8 should win. But we want to convert that to a probability, and just happens these happen to sum to 10, so that's really handy. And so we would convert this to an 80% probability that this was correct. This would be a 10% probability, and this would be a 10%. So the probabilities sum to 1. So we take their relative weights, add them up, divide them by each other. So we get this. We add them all up. They add up to 10. This one is 8. Divide by the total is 10. And so softmax does that for us. So that converts these arbitrary numbers into probabilities, and each of those is a probability. And again, we don't necessarily have to do that, worry too much about that. But that's why our output layers, the last one is a softmax layer, and again, it'll then output the probabilities of each unit. So we will set up that and run that. So your question here for the write-up is to talk a little bit about why this is structured and how these connections work. Once we have this network made, again, each network we give it a name. So this learning model we're just calling model. Here we're just creating it. We'll use some different names later on. So once we have that model defined, we'll say model.compile. Later on we'll learn more about some of these other optimizations and loss functions, that sort of stuff, but again, we're not going to worry about that right now. And once we have that, we fit the data. We specify the training input and the training output, X train and Y train, and then also the validation data, X valid and Y valid for this, and then we specify that. Now we will train each epoch, and so in this case it's going to go over 1,700 different images to train each epoch for this. And each time it will tell us what the accuracy is. So initially the accuracy after the first pass, it actually was 76%, so it learned a lot during that first set of things. But and the validation accuracy was 83%, was very good. And again, over time it should train and get better. So we went from 76 to 82 to 84, 87% and stuff. And so we can then specify. So we can specify in our training how many epochs we do, and this can take a while. You can see it's finally done with the 10 epochs, and it's got up to 84%, and we can actually train. It's not uncommon to train this for much longer. These initial ones actually run very fast, but again, later on, this training, this fit stuff might take hours to run. But on our initial data sets, these will be relatively simple. So, but in the future, in a couple of weeks, these will take much longer. We can also display this training accuracy here and the loss accuracy. So two things to watch. One is the loss. So that's it. What that is a measure of is on the outputs. When we look at the output, what's the difference between the actual output and what we predict? I mean, the predicted, what the correct output was and what it what we predicted. And we take that loss and we use that to change the weights. So, and we want this to go down. Hopefully, as we get more accurate, this loss will decrease over time. But if this loss ever gets to 0 or very low, that means that we don't have any, we can't change the weights because we're very close to the predictions all the time. And the accuracy is kind of the opposite, just the percent of accuracy. We want this to get close to 1. So we should see the loss decrease and accuracy increase. And again, we look at the validation stuff and we'll see that also. So rather than just looking there, sometimes it's nice to graph this out. So here's a graph of the loss function again going down. It's still not to 0. That's what that suggests is it would be useful to train this more. We only trained for 10 epochs, so maybe we want to train for 20, 50, or 100 epochs until this loss goes down. And also our accuracy is increasing here, and it's still going up, so training might help some more. And one thing we notice is that as we go, we will start overfitting our data, and so we'll get the training accuracy to be high, and our validation accuracy might actually start going down. That's why we have separate validation accuracy. So if we train this for 100 epochs, we might see a different value here. Okay, once we've trained the model, we can actually evaluate the model on some test data. Again, this should give the same results of our validation data for now. And so again, we can run an evaluation function and say that we are getting 81% accuracy so far. And again, it's similar up here with our validation accuracy was actually 87 here, so actually a little bit lower below that with our testing data. So we can also then use this model to make predictions. So we can look at a particular sample of our from our database. We can pull that test sample out here and do some manipulations to set it up, and then we can use our model to predict, given that sample number, what the probability is, and it will predict the probability in different ways. So it actually gives us the probability of each of the different classes. So 0, 0, 0, 0, and so it really thinks it's this third value. It's 100% sure that it's that value here with this, and so it's predicting it's 0, 1, 2, the third value. And so it's 3, and that is, if remember, we had a list of our different things, and so it is thinking that that is the right one for that. The correct class. Oh, I think I have an error in this code. Let me fix this. Sorry, I was predicting out the correct class from the wrong data set, the training set, and not. So yes, this should be address, and the right answer is address. We can actually try different samples here. We can try 301 and run this same thing and see how it does. And again, it's actually getting this one incorrect, where it's thinking it should be a coat and it's actually a dress for this, and it is quite sure that it is a coat, and it just gets it wrong again. So our prediction accuracy was only 80% here, so we're getting some of these wrong. So in your book, the textbook walks you through this, building an image classifier using the sequential API. It talks about this fashion mints database, loading that up, and this is where we got lots of the code. I've modified the code a little bit here, but again, here's how we set up the layers, and it walks you through a description of what each of the layers are, and here's the code basically that we have, and goes over that, prints out the summary of the network, how it's set up. And again, you can actually, it talks about how you can go in and look at the model and the weights and all that stuff. We're not going to worry too much about that here. We are compiling the model here, and talks a little bit about the code that. So again, you might want to read through this. Also training or calling fit on the model. Again, our code does that. And then plotting out the training things. I actually broke this up into 2 graphs rather than 1 graph like this, so I have a little different version of that in our stuff. and then evaluating this on our test data, and then making some predictions on it. And again, I've kind of expanded this test code a little bit here because I think it makes it a little clearer. And then this is where we're going to end off here at 307 here. We're not going to talk about building a regression model or and the later stuff, this functional API and stuff, we're going to wait till unit 5, and we'll come back here for that. But there are a couple more sections here. So again, we've been going over section 2 on the minced fashion minced data set, but we really can't do this without doing the iris flowers, right? I mean, you're missing the iris flowers. So here's the same sort of kind of structure with the iris flowers. We're importing the iris flower data here. We are setting up that our training and test data. We've got to do some categorical modifications to some of this, but here's our data set. And now we're going to actually put this all in one cell here. So we're going to we're going to define our neural network. We're going to print out a summary. We're going to compile the neural network. We're going to train the neural network. We're using this fixed function. We're doing it for 50 epochs, and then we're using this validation set, and we're going to display the results, and then we're actually going to score it. So all that data code is actually put together here. So here's our network structure here, and now we're going through training. It should train relatively fast because it's a quick data set. Here's our loss, and here's our accuracy going forward. So like here's an example of accuracy, and again, this is a relatively small data set, and so we train it on our training data, and we have our validation data as we go through. And your job is to try to change accuracy, see if you can train it for more epochs, see if maybe having more hidden layers with nodes in each one. So you can actually go up here to the model. Here's our our input here, and this is the number of network nodes in our first hidden layer. We can change that, and here's our second layer. We could change that. We could actually get rid of this one layer if we wanted, or we want to make sure we leave the input and the outputs there, those layers. We could actually, if we wanted more layers, another layer here, we could actually just duplicate that line and have another layer with different versions. So see if you can play with some different things. Later on we'll talk a lot more about how many layers and the number of hidden units you want in each layer and stuff like that. But for now you can just kind of play with this. So your questions are, can you improve this accuracy for this? Okay, and then there's a prediction. We just talked about how once we have an iris flower, we can then predict what species it was. So if we have this measurements, we can transform that data and make a prediction. One thing we are doing with neural networks often is we are doing some input transformation. So on this network data up here, we're applying a min-max scaler to this data so that all the values, because generally we want to be feeding values between 0 and 1 or -1 and +1 into a neural network. So we often scale that data. If we're scaling that data there, when we're actually making our predictions, we want to apply that same scaler to our database. We're making this prediction here, and we can predict what flower species it is. Similarly, in the last project you did the breast cancer data. So this looks at that same database of breast cancer data. Remember, there were like 30 some different characteristics, and we're predicting if this is malignant or benign. And again, we can set up this database, set up our data here, and then here's our network that we can train. There are 30 inputs, 2 outputs, either malignant or benign, that we have set up. We can then compile our network. We can then train it and plot the results, so it can go through this training. This is a relatively small data set, so we can get it. So here again, we're seeing the loss decrease over time, which is good. We're seeing the training accuracy increase over time. And then your question is, can you make this model a little more accurate? Can this beat like support vector machines or k-nearest neighbors or decision trees from the mini project last time, and work on that? So see how that goes. and let me know. And again, put your answers in the write-up. Hope you enjoyed this unit.